the year 2020 of the pandemic, that we were all sitting at home and we were all locked down, and the government said we're going to just give you massive stimulus around the world and it'll all be fine. The single biggest year when the maximum number of billionaires were created in the world was the year 2020.
You have made a fascinating point in the book, that is inflation, interest rates and asset price bubbles, and the tendency to look at consumer price without looking at asset price increases. Would you like to share or expand on this a little bit?
Yeah.
And what is the balance and how do you find that balance?
Yeah, so I think the point that you're trying to make here is this, that I've argued in the book that the central banks around the world, their focus has historically been on consumer price inflation, which is that as long as consumer prices are relatively restrained, we can go out and stimulate and do as much as you want, right? That's what central banks around the world have had this sort of mandate. As I argue in the book, that consumer prices in general around the world have remained low for the last 40 years or so because of globalization, because of technology, right? You have so much cheap labor, cheap goods coming from China, other places because of globalization, that's kept consumer prices low. So central banks have got emboldened by saying, okay, consumer prices are low, we can now throw as much money at the system to try and promote economic growth. What I say is that what this has done instead is that it has boosted asset prices. That a lot of this money has gone into boosting asset prices of stocks, bonds, and property. And to me, this is the single most important thing. If there's one symbol of what's gone wrong with capitalism in the West, it is the fact that you have had a runaway growth in property prices. Like as I argue in the book, that about like a generation ago, it took about 3 years for a person buying a home in America to be able to make the down payment. Now, it's taking 19 years, right? So can you imagine the thing? Most Americans today in their 20s are still living in with their parents because they can't afford to buy a home. It's become that expensive. There's a real affordability crisis in America. So in terms of, you've had this massive boost up in asset prices, and then also the fact that you've had a profusion in billionaires. And one of the reasons I wrote this book also, when the idea of the book came up in the year 2020 of the pandemic, that we were all sitting at home and we were all locked down, and the government said we're going to just give you massive stimulus around the world and it'll all be fine. The single biggest year when the maximum number of billionaires were created in the world was the year 2020, during the pandemic, that you had this. So that was my point, that you throw all this money at the system, and the biggest beneficiaries tend to be the rich because it boosts asset prices. And if it boosts asset prices, who owns them? It's the rich. And when you have things like, now stocks going up, okay, fine, people feel they can't afford it. But property prices also going up so sharply. In America, property prices have surged. Property prices going up so sharply really hurts the average person, because the one aspiration that people have in life is to own their own home. And in America today, as I said, most 20-year-olds are saying, we can't afford our own home, so we're living in with their parents. That feels very depressing.